Welcome to the Dean's Honor Symposium. My name is Mac Todman. I'm a faculty member in the psychology department here at the university. And it's been my distinct honor to work with 4 wonderful students in developing this panel today. Even though they've come from very different areas of study, they have different majors, and they're in different stages of their academic careers, they did an incredible job in terms of blending a number of different topics into a synthetic whole. None of this happened in a vacuum. We were helped by a lot of people, and I'd like to sort of single out a few people before we start. First of all, Jennifer Riegel, who is the Director of Student Programs, and for which, if she wasn't here, this wouldn't happen. I'd like to thank Olga Brado and her first-year students who were nice enough to volunteer to come and give us feedback twice during the semester, and without that, I think this would never be as good as it's going to be. A couple of reminders. First of all, there are a number of panels taking place today, and this is only one of many. I hope that you can see as many as you can. The location and times of those panels are in your program, so please consult that to get some guidance. And this presentation will take approximately an hour. There will be a section at the end where you can ask questions of the panel, and I encourage you to do that because I want you to make them as nervous as possible. But they're really great, and I think you'll enjoy it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 4th Annual Dean's Honor Symposium. You're joining Michelle, Toni Marie, Chloe, and myself, Sjournee, for our panel titled Boundaries, Claiming Agency in a Society of Institutional Betrayal. We developed this title based on our mutual belief that institutions betray people by initiating boundaries that restrict the agency of those people. We each conducted individual projects where we explored the ways each of these concepts, which are defined on the slide above me, interact, specifically within the institution of patriarchy. Further, each of us sought out to reclaim some of that agency that patriarchy has stripped from us, or those that our projects are focused on, whether it be through our body, our rights, or our dignity. We hope to inspire our audience to both evaluate and reclaim their own privilege and agency. Now, before we begin the presentations, I want to introduce you to the panelists, starting with Michelle Mason, who will speak on her project, Domestic Violence, Survivors, and the Challenges in Gaining Freedom from Incarceration. Michelle's project centers on women in the system of incarceration and their experience with domestic violence. Then Toni Marie Conliffe's presentation, titled Beyond Consent, the intersection of work between advocates, educators, and researchers, which is focused on the symposium she procured funding for and launched in April 2018, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Followed by Chloe Kaler, who will share her project, The Mental Health Effects of Street Harassment, where she brings attention to the encounters women have with sexual harassment on a daily basis. And then we'll conclude with myself, Sjournee Cornelius-Quaidoo, with my project, The Gap Between Us, a Personal Geography, which is a collection of written work produced in the form of a zine during a study abroad program in France. So thank you all for attending our panel. We are very excited to share our work with you. I want to now introduce Michelle Mason, who addresses the restricted agency among women in the system of incarceration and how it reinforces aspects of their trauma from past domestic abuses while in the various carceral institutions. Here's Michelle Mason.
Hello, my name is Michelle Mason, and I want to thank you for coming here to join my fellow panelists tonight in discussing aspects of oppressive institutions that we have been in conversation with throughout our separate projects. My own project began when I was accepted to the Lang Social Science Fellowship. I was given the opportunity to intern at a non-for-profit called Sanctuary for Families, which provides services for survivors of gender-based violence and human trafficking. At Sanctuary, I was introduced to their Incarcerated Survivors of Gender Violence initiative, which sought to help survivors who are unjustly incarcerated and being denied parole. As I read through the parole and clemency packets of past Sanctuary clients, I was dumbfounded. All of these survivors had flawless disciplinary records, college degrees, and communal leadership accomplishments. Still, they were constantly being denied. I began to look into the legal guidelines and requirements for gaining parole, and it did not add up. The Incarcerated Survivors of Gender Violence Initiative inspired my research project and became a recruitment site for participants. This research aimed to explain the experience of incarcerated survivors throughout the 3 main stages of incarceration: the correctional facility experience, going before the parole board, and reentry. The experience of the survivors going before the parole board was a starting point of this research that later revealed the connection between the experience in the facilities as it relates to the parole process and ultimately how it affects these women upon reentry. Looking at my research paper and deciding what would be the most meaningful to present to you, as well as what linked my fellow panelists' projects together, I began to focus on how exactly the institution of prison and even the criminal justice system at large perpetuates the same types of abuses that the survivors had experienced in their intimate partnerships. I first want to present to you the statistics of the women's prison population as it relates to abuse. So according to the ACLU, nearly 60% of people in women's prisons nationwide, and as many as 94% of some of the women's prisons populations have had a history of physical or sexual abuse before becoming incarcerated. And then according to a study that was done by the Correctional Association of New York, 75% of women in New York's prisons suffered severe physical violence by an intimate partner during adulthood. I also want to take a moment to clarify the context of my research, as well as the bigger picture of women's prisons as it is situated in society today. The site where I focused on were women's prisons, specifically in the state of New York. The survivors who I spoke to for my research are all cis women, both Black and white. I want to acknowledge that when I speak of oppression and marginalization, the most marginalized inmates in these facilities are Black transgender women. Women's prisons populations include cis, straight, LGBTQ+, gender nonconforming individuals, and men. This population includes all races, ethnicities, and immigration statuses. So I was watching this year's Beyond the Bars convening, which is a coalition of various organizations who work on initiatives and issues facing individuals who are incarcerated in women's prisons. Angela Davis had video conferenced in to show her support, and I felt that this quote that she said perfectly summed up exactly how I felt once completing my research project, and I think it echoes the same themes that unifies our panel on institutional betrayal as a whole. She said, by looking at women in prison, we better understand how state violence insinuates itself into the intimate lives of human beings and how intimate violence bolsters institutional and state violence. When I first heard this quote, I began to think of my own academic focus on mass incarceration throughout the last 4 years of the New School. The subject of mass incarceration and the mass enslavement of the Black male population has been brought to the mainstream, and rightfully so. But despite there being a larger men's prisons population, women's prisons population has grown at double the pace in the last 40 years. But looking at what we know about institutions and the reform and policy mistakes that we have made in the past, we must not rely on the mainstream or the most visible population to provide full and equal justice. We need to look at the most marginalized communities affected by incarceration to understand the problems with our institutions. But we have yet to bring the intersectionality of race, gender, sexuality, and incarceration into the mainstream. By bringing attention to women's prisons, we can begin to unravel the white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative, and colonial violence that has been thrust upon the most vulnerable and marginalized bodies in our communities. So first, I want to explain the abuse to prison pipeline. Victims of abuse are increasingly at risk for incarceration due to a myriad of reasons. It's actually helpful to look at the crimes that the survivors have been charged with in order to understand this pipeline. These crimes are typically a means for survival. Illegal drugs are often used as a way to cope with the effects of trauma. Many survivors are coerced into committing various crimes by their abusers to avoid further abuse. It could be as simple as a mother having to steal diapers for her baby because she is being financially restricted by her abuser. It could be as severe as an abuser trafficking a survivor and a survivor being incorrectly charged with prostitution. In extreme cases, survivors know their only freedom from abuse is to kill their abuser in an act of self-defense, which the state then narrowly defines as homicide. Now let's fast forward a bit. After the trial or a plea deal, these survivors have been sentenced based on their crime to serve time in correctional facilities. Now I want to ask you what you guys think the purpose of incarceration is. And before that, I'll add some context. One of the women who I spoke with was 17 years old when she went in for a felony. She had an indeterminate sentence, meaning that she had 10 years and she was going to be eligible for parole with a maximum of 20 years. The two other survivors who I spoke with had life sentences with the eligibility for parole after 20 to 15 years. So I'm going to ask you again, what do you think the purpose of incarceration is? Anyone?
I mean, it's partially a deterrent for people.
Mhm.
If you're facing a certain sentence, it's supposed to deter you from committing something.
A deterrent? Anything else? Okay, yes.
Many people believe that it should be for rehabilitation, but there's not programs set up with them that are actually rehabilitating.
Rehabilitation, okay. So we have a bunch of different theories. Some people believe that prison is solely punitive or for retribution. If you did something bad, you deserve to suffer. If we just look at correctional facilities, the word correction, we're looking to correct a behavior, right? Though we've acknowledged that there are many reasons for committing crimes, and they're far more complex for these survivors than just a behavioral issue. We were told that prisons are a space of rehabilitation, so an individual can enter society in a better place. But speaking with the women for my research, it became clear that the facilities were not a place of rehabilitation, but a place for further abuse. To explain this abuse, I think it's helpful to look at a very outdated power and control wheel that is used to explain domestic violence relationships. As I finished my interviews with the survivors, I began to see the parallels that might be helpful to explain my findings and point directly to the abuse carried out by the state that mirrors the same tactics that abusers use. I created my own wheel to illustrate how prisons perpetuate their abuse. For time purposes, I can only mention a couple. The women gave accounts of physical, sexual, and verbal abuse on behalf of correctional officers. Correctional officers, specifically in cases of sexual violence, would often intimidate and threaten them using their own power and privilege over the women so they wouldn't report. In regards to emotional abuse, it's actually helpful to look at the parole boards. They were one of the biggest perpetrators. All of the women, when you go before the parole board, you're asked to read your crime and walk the board through something that could have happened 20 years ago that they don't even fully remember. With an understanding of the effects of trauma on the brain, a lot of the women had repressed the memories from their acts of self-defense. The parole board would continuously badger the woman and in one case, make derogatory comments to them. One of the survivors who I spoke with explained that she would begin to disassociate and detach as a defense from the board's abuse. She was able to actually gain therapeutic assistance, which is where she realized that this was a defense mechanism that she had learned from all of her past experiences with abuse. So when the parole board would see her not making eye contact or looking down and shutting down, they would think, oh, she's not remorseful or ready for release, when in reality, she was just being re-traumatized. And I could go on and on with the parallels, but as our panel title hopefully gave you a spoiler, these women do work to reclaim agency in many ways. This is a quote from one of the women and I think it really summed up a major way in which these women attempt to combat abuse from the institution and help each other gain freedom. So she says, men's time is different than women's time. Men go into prison to work on their bodies, women go in to create families. Each of the women I spoke to had a similar experience within the first week entering a facility. They would all be called into the law library by a group of inmates. At first, they were nervous and didn't know what to expect. But the inmates assured them that they were there to help and welcome them. Due to the lengthiness of their sentences, they were considered long-timers. Long-timers would create these informal coalitions for support and mentorship for one another. Facilities did have counselors for these inmates, but they were often doing multiple jobs and have heavy caseloads. Ultimately, the best way to get adequate resources was to rely on one another and their own experiences. These women would be able to get each other contacted with outside organizations, do mock parole board interviews, and have a general community to help one another navigate the system. Along with the collectives, these women partook an immense amount of unwaged or low-wage physical and emotional labor to maintain safety and community. Their titles included teacher's assistants, suicide watch, and grievance liaisons. One of the women I spoke with ran multiple programs and founded clubs and therapy groups inside. She told me that the main goal was to bring humanity into the prison when the institution was constantly trying to dehumanize them. She wrote to churches to send money and start gardens and have movie nights. She created a mentorship program for younger inmates. She worked with outside domestic violence organizations to create therapy groups whenever a facility gave them funding. Overall, the women became caretakers and the only source of humanity for one another. Many of them expressed feeling that they were being denied parole and kept there because they were practically running prisons for the administrators. When the women were released, they felt unprepared for the outside world. Still, they acknowledged how lucky they were to have gotten support from outside organizations while they were inside to prepare for reentry, but they acknowledged that there were other inmates that were not as lucky. My final quote is from a woman who has successfully reentered, and she continues to actually advocate and work with prison populations. She says, "I always tell people out here in the community, wouldn't you want us to be at our best when we come out? If I'm your neighbor and violent crimes are coming out, wouldn't you want someone to support you rather than someone who has turned vicious from being totally shut off from society? You want a softer person when they come out, someone who feels like they belong. No one can stomp on someone harder than they can stomp on themselves." So what can we as a community do? As we enter a period where states across the country are addressing criminal justice reform, we need to keep prison abolition at the forefront. Investing in alternatives to incarceration and reallocating funds from imprisonment to communities to help address the issues of mass incarceration at large. Still, these individuals are real survivors, and they're coping with a myriad of forces, making it difficult for them to stay afloat while they are incarcerated and have a successful reentry where they can gain employment, housing, and safety. We need to mindfully assist those inside and try not to reaffirm the trap that the institution puts them in. There are little ways that we can hold the system accountable, as well as help those incarcerated prepare for reentry. As individuals, we can express our thoughts on domestic violence survivors who are charged with crimes to our district attorneys and push them to not prosecute or mindfully prosecute. We can participate in court watching and letter writing campaigns to hold those in power accountable and let them know that we understand the complexities of the person that the state is now simplifying to a criminal. As an educational institution, we need to continue to invest in prison initiatives and provide education and practical credits for those inside so they can achieve degrees and make them more successful candidates upon reentry. Additionally, outside organizations need to ensure that survivor leaders are present in all campaign and policy efforts. Overall, I hope that we learn to approach those who have been incarcerated with an open mind and compassion. As an individual outside of the institution, it is imperative that we show those survivors that we care and that we see them. The biggest turning point in all the stories of the women I spoke to revolves around the realization that someone from the outside was willing to bear witness to their experience, to break the barriers and isolation that the institution sets up and acknowledge the experience holistically and ensure them that they are worthy and they are more than a victim of violence, more than a criminal, and more than a prisoner. I want to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'm excited to introduce the next panelist, Toni Marie. Toni Marie will be presenting on the challenges in bringing discourse around consent into educational settings, as well as what it means to thoughtfully organize and advocate for sexual education.
Hello, everyone. My name is Toni Marie Conliffe, and I will be presenting on Beyond Consent, the intersection of work between advocates, educators, and researchers. My presentation will be based on the Beyond Consent Symposium, which took place exactly 1 year ago today. Before I begin, I would like to take a brief moment of silence for all survivors of sexual assault or abuse. Thank you. Every April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, often referred to as SAM. If you've noticed, my fellow panelists and I are all wearing teal ribbons in support of survivors. We encourage you, if you are on or around our new school campus, to choose another way that you can get involved in SAM. You were given these flyers, and you can also find copies on the tables in the back of the room. I've been working with Student Health Services as a peer health advocate to facilitate the Sexy Collective since my first year at the new school. The Sexy Collective was started by Lang students who did not like the way consent was being taught in the Lang first-year seminars. Born was the Sexy Collective, with a mission to lead the university in sexual education and sexual violence prevention policies and programming that is both inclusive and comprehensive to accommodate our growing and diverse student body. Almost 9 years later, the Sexy Collective upholds this mission in a variety of different events, both on and off campus. This academic year, we hosted multiple sexualities, a holiday soiree, a screening of The Hunting Ground, and we are currently prepping for our second Take Back the Night March happening on the 24th of this month. If you are interested in getting involved with the Sexy Collective, please send us an email or message us on Instagram. It was during my first year working with the Sexy Collective that I was able to work with Milo Du. In 2017, Milo, a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in psychology, and their colleague Allie Shames Dawson worked together to create the Beyond Consent Symposium. Milo, with a background in activism and advocacy, and Allie with a background in research, found inspiration for the symposium from gaps found when comparing their work. During a Sexy Collective meeting, Milo asked me if I'd be interested in helping write a grant to help fund the symposium. I would sincerely like to thank the Eugene Lang Office of Civic Engagement and Social Justice for providing us a mini grant for the symposium. The Beyond Consent Symposium took place on Sunday, April 15, 2018. There were over 100 RSVPs from all around the country. The conference was over 8 hours long and featured 16 different panelists and speakers. In the next slides, I will give a brief synopsis of themes found throughout all of the panels and why we must all work towards better sexual education and sexual assault awareness and prevention. In 2014, California garnered widespread attention when Governor Brown signed the nation's first affirmative consent standard for colleges to use in campus sexual assault cases. This law later became known as Yes Means Yes. The law established that consent is voluntary and affirmative, and it is an agreement to engage in sexual activity that can be revoked at any time, and that a previous relationship does not constitute as consent, and that coercion or threat of force cannot be used to establish consent. Additionally, the law clarified that a person who is incapacitated by drugs or alcohol or is not fully awake is incapable of giving consent. The map on screen lists states and their legislation around consent. As you can see, California is the only state colored in blue. That means that they are the only state in our country that has both high school and college level sexual assault legislation that includes an affirmative consent definition. Green states have passed sexual assault legislation that does not mention affirmative consent. Yellow states have state or city-wide initiatives to consider an affirmative consent policy. And lastly, states that are colored red, like my home state of West Virginia, have no policy or legislation and no plan underway to create any. In states that do not have comprehensive legislation or policies regarding consent, the one exception and the place we are starting to see real change is on college campuses nationwide. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 protects people from sex and gender discrimination in educational programs and activities at institutions that receive federal financial assistance. Title IX offices on campus are one of the only resources that students that face sexual assault may have. As you can see on screen, college women are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted than to be robbed. But on campuses around the country, we always see strong campus security forces, while most universities do not employ a full-time Title IX coordinator. Lack of funding for Title IX and offices that specifically support survivors lead to low rates of reporting among college-age women. In November of 2018, the Department of Education released new regulations that will create a barrier between students and their ability to report. According to Betsy DeVos, universities will only pursue claims that are so severe, persuasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a person access to the school's education programs or activity. The Beyond Consent Symposium was an event where those that were directly affected by policies and legislations mentioned previously came to meet, share knowledge and experience, and create activism on their own campuses to fight against these oppressive policies and institutions. While Milo graduated in the spring of 2018, Allie and I are continuing this work to improve future research, advocacy, and education. This month, we will be launching a Facebook group open to conference members and the public to allow for the better share of information and questions. We will also be releasing the entire 8-hour audio recording of the symposium as a podcast, where you will be able to listen to each speaker and panelists that have their own episode. While the Beyond Consent Symposium was very successful, it was not perfect. We offered the survey at the end, and of those that completed, 25 offered to share their feedback to aid future research. On screen, you can see some of the answers to the last question we asked, and the question states, please list anything you wish the conference organizers, panelists, or presenters would have addressed, but did not. Were there perspectives that were not in the room and should have been? Again, I would like to thank the Eugene Lang Office of Civic Engagement and Social Justice for providing funds for the symposium so that we can continue to keep events like this free for the public. And I encourage you all to join the conversation and advocate for comprehensive sexual education, affirmative consent legislation, and support of survivors. In the next presentation, my good friend, Kaler, will present her research on the direct consequences of violations of consent.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kaler, and I will be presenting my project on the mental health effects of gender-based street harassment. I would like to start off by thanking the many people who helped to get me here, most notably Professor Jessica Gross, who provided me with a platform to create my project. It was in her class, Writing the Mind, in the spring of 2018 that I began my research into the mental health effects of gender-based street harassment. Gender-based street harassment is defined as unwanted comments, gestures, and actions forced on a stranger in a public place without their consent, and is directed at them because of their perceived sex, gender expression, or sexual orientation. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever experienced some form of gender-based street harassment throughout your lives? Take a look around. That's a pretty significant amount. You can put your hands down. Thank you. Various studies on the prevalence of gender-based street harassment have been conducted, and each one has found that between 65 to 80% of all women experience street harassment in their lives. I want to acknowledge that it is not just cis women who experience gender-based street harassment, and that gender-based street harassment is not the only form of street harassment. Harassment is about power and control, and is often a manifestation of societal discrimination like sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, classism, and racism, and no form is ever okay. However, because my research touches on my own personal experiences of street harassment, which have been mostly gender-based, as a femme-presenting woman, this is the population and type of street harassment I centered on the most. This particular image comes from a study conducted at Cornell. I'm acknowledging it for two reasons. One, it breaks down the term street harassment into more specific categories. This study not only found that a vast majority of women have experienced street harassment, but half had been groped or fondled and 77% had been followed just within the past year. Two, as you can see at the bottom, it addresses the prevalence of avoidance tactics taken by women to prevent street harassment, which points to the larger issue of the mental health effects street harassment can have. I personally have been harassed because of my perceived gender more times than I can count. Most often, it's been limited to catcalling, meaning unsolicited comments and/or whistling. However, I have also been groped and followed on more than one occasion. I find myself constantly partaking in these avoidance tactics, including wearing headphones to drown out the comments and looking at the ground when I walk because I found eye contact, even just accidentally for less than a second, increases the likelihood of harassment. My experiences then both inspired and furthered my research into this topic. Street harassment has become very normalized in our society. So, as I purposely became more cognizant of it happening and my reactions to it, I started to question the effects it could have on my and other people's mental health. My research and my project then consisted of both academic sources and various forms of personal interviews. I found lots of academic research indicating that gender-based street harassment does in fact have very direct links to affecting mental health. As Emma Rooney, an NYU professor, states, the internalization of sexual objectification leads to constant self-monitoring, creating a state of self-consciousness that breeds feelings of shame and anxiety. I then began conducting interviews. I asked many of my female friends about their experiences with gender-based street harassment. Every single one of them, despite living in various places across the country, including large cities like Manhattan, LA, and Chicago, to small rural college towns in Virginia and upstate New York like Charlottesville, Blacksburg, and Syracuse, has experienced gender-based street harassment at some point in their lives. Most of them were limited to catcalling. While the prevalence of these instances did vary, each person still felt a constant sense of anxiety about it happening again. As my friend Ellie Four put it, It's not anxiety about the actual words someone will say to you. It's the fact that they are comfortable publicly, verbally harassing you, so who knows what else they would be comfortable in doing to you. These girls, myself included, live in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety anytime they are in a social setting, fearing not only that they may be verbally harassed, but further, if that comment could turn into something more physical, like assault. I then started wondering if men really knew the impact their actions were having. In casual conversations with male friends, most of them seemed to think street harassment, especially catcalling, was no big deal. In fact, that it was a compliment. That then inspired me to do a little research of my own. I, along with one such male friend who was particularly adamant that catcalling was just a form of flattery, took to the streets of Manhattan. We walked around Union Square and Tompkins Square Park several times with the intention to interview the men that catcalled me. I had him come along, one, so that he could see the true effects of catcalling, but two, and most importantly, as a bodyguard. He walked about 10 paces behind me. I had a voice recording on my phone going at all times as I walked around waiting for someone to catcall me. Not surprisingly enough, I didn't have to wait very long. After each initial comment, some of which are quoted on the screen, I stopped and asked if I could talk with them for a few moments. After they all gave an enthusiastic, but also perhaps surprised yes, I asked them why they had said their comments to me in the first place. These were some of their answers. Then I followed up by asking if they knew that what they had done was considered street harassment, and that street harassment has been linked to having negative effects on people's mental health. These were some of their responses. Most of them said something along the lines of, "Oh no, I was just complimenting you." None of them acknowledged that what they had done was street harassment, nonetheless that it could have a negative impact on my or other people's mental health. I also think it is important to note the time frame and frequency of these instances. On my first research attempt, I was catcalled 3 times in the first 15 minutes of walking around. Keep in mind, that also included the time it took for me to stop and talk to each one of the men. I spent about 20 minutes in Union Square and another 20 minutes in Tompkins Square Park on the first day, and then several more sessions at Tompkins Square Park on other days since. Each subsequent instance went about the same. In interviewing these street harassers, I was able to claim some sense of agency that the institution of patriarchy strips me of on a daily basis. However, when I did that, it was in densely populated spaces in broad daylight, and I had a friend following me because I knew that engaging these men increased the likelihood of something more happening. Yet I still felt very anxious and scared the entire time. Therefore, I cannot recommend this as a tactic to combat any form of street harassment. Instead, I think it should open up broader conversations. However, it is imperative that the perpetrators, in this case being men, be a part of these conversations. Understanding the reality and the prevalence of street harassment changed my friend/bodyguard's perspective on its true nature. At the end of our first experiment, he said, some of which is quoted above, "Before this, I just viewed catcalling as something that mostly happens in movies, and that may happen in real life, but just super infrequently, and could be confused with a guy attempting to show legitimate interest. I was really surprised to see, 1, how often it happens, and 2, that these guys were doing it just for the hell of it. They all seemed flustered and surprised when you actually responded to them. I definitely see now how repeated street harassment has every ability to cause increased anxiety, depression, shame, or self-consciousness, because those are normal human reactions we've all experienced when we are put in inappropriate, unnecessary, and uncomfortable situations." His quote shows that there is some potential to undo these systems of betrayal. However, the work needs to be done by the perpetrators, not the victims. This project required me to become more cognizant of the ways I exist in different spaces and the effects those spaces and relationships within those spaces can have. In the next presentation, Sjournee delves into this idea even further as she recounts her time documenting her past and current experiences on a study abroad trip to France. Thank you very much.
So in the summer of 2018, I was able to participate in the Lang study abroad program's trip to France, called James Baldwin Reading and Writing in France. This is where I created my project, The Gap Between Us. When I first began this project and pitched it to the Lang Opportunity Awards and the Lang Global Ambassadors, it began with letters to James Baldwin and wondering, why did he leave America? Baldwin references his desire to leave America in some of his work. On the slide above me, I've quoted a statement Baldwin made in the notes section of his play, The Amen Corner. He wrote, "No one really wishes to leave his homeland. I left because I was driven out, because my homeland would not allow me to grow in the only direction in which I could grow. This is but another way of saying that all my countrymen had been able to offer me during the 24 years that I tried to live here was death, and death, moreover, on their terms. I had escaped, but I had not escaped myself." This quote made his intention with moving to France quite clear. I realized I was so caught up in Baldwin's story, especially his relationship with understanding love and his father, that I was neglecting to understand my own, which ultimately was fueling my interest in understanding his desire to escape, as he says. This was a major learning opportunity for me during this program. This led me to return to my own process of thinking and understand, why did I leave America? The gap between us then became an outlet for my personal geography, meaning an exploration of myself while navigating multiple environments, which for me meant the various institutions revolving around race, family, and gender, but also aspects of love. This influenced me to learn more about the impacts various relationships have had in my life and on myself. So I wrote a letter to significant people in my life every day, from July to August during the duration of the 6-week program, beginning with my former partner, my sister, my mother, Alice Walker, James Baldwin, my close friends, and most importantly, my father. I workshopped my written letters and poems in my Baldwin writing class for critique. Then I would discuss them outside of class, collect feedback, review it on my own, and then rework it till it felt kind of like the final product to me, and then stylize it for my zine. On the slide above me, I have included my poem, A Guide to Forgiveness. It's an example of my writing process. It shows how my writing subconsciously differs whether I was in a rush or carefully translated my thoughts, which I found fascinating. Even my professor for the Baldwin writing program, Scott Korb, asked me, "Do you have an intention with the changes in the writing?" And it became an additional element for us to bring awareness to throughout the process of my work. Like, why did I change the writing for this one in comparison to the original? Was it sloppy? Was it for aesthetic? Was it my emotional response translated into my handwriting, etc.? It goes to show that the evolution that writing takes, it shows the evolution writing takes to get to its final rendition. Understanding the complexities of interracial relationships, specifically between women of color and white men, has been a curiosity of mine, based on the complexities of Blackness in America, put into an intimate dynamic with whiteness and gender in America. So I read pieces by authors that identified as women of color with references to relationships. Specifically, Alice Walker's Can't Keep a Good Woman Down, and Sonia Sanchez's Homegirls and Hand Grenades, thanks to my classmate Sophia. In addition to closely analyzing James Baldwin's Another Country, which was an assigned reading during the program, and I highly recommend you all read. Then, as I continued this journey of understanding intimate relationships, it drew me to understanding the violence brought upon Black bodies, whether physical or emotional. I produced several poems that address this over the 6 weeks, but most notably were my 2 poems, Yes, Master, and a feature presentation. Baldwin's writing taught me to be honest and not naive in speaking my truth. It happened, it's real, and it should not be overlooked. It should be understood. I realized that these boundaries placed were structured by institutions of race, gender, family, and patriarchy, but ultimately were reinforced by me, because these were institutions that were all I knew. And I was driven to question them, all of them, throughout the summer. Now I want to read one of my poems, Yes, Master, which is on the slide above me. Perhaps the complexity of our relationship goes as deep as America's past with slavery. I can't help but think of the dynamic between a master and a slave. The violence of sex with you is something I have felt for a long time, and I could not find the words to express, and may still not be able to express successfully. How does one successfully articulate suffering? Not being able to comprehend if I am with you physically by choice, or from my internal duty I feel from my ancestors, and perhaps yours. Needing to pleasure you in order to survive. The need to remain where I am with you, emotionally embedded, I'm protected, although I am in fear of being closer to death without you. I'm trying to understand my intimate love for you, My relationship with my body feels out of my control. Yes, Master was created after many reflections of my interracial relationship. It was a piece I workshopped while I was in France and went through a couple renditions from its original. For me, it's a personal piece that even now I'm hesitant to share, but felt very necessary in understanding my thought process and how I structured poems throughout the collection. I often use parentheses for emphasis, italics for questions, and separated text for tone and emphasis. On the slide above, you can see another one of my poems, A Feature Presentation, which was also workshopped during the program. As a class, we watched The Price of a Ticket and I'm Not Your Negro, both of which are films that centered around James Baldwin. I took lots of notes on both of the films, and I found myself feeling frustrated, emotionally moved, and emotionally drained, which I translated into this poem. I use the distance between the text as a method to illustrate how non-people of color can separate themselves from the content displayed in the film that suggests violence, isolation, and racism, but also suggesting a method of time. In addition, I utilize the concept of scrolling, like credits in a film, to emphasize the text. On the slides above, you can see some other examples within my collection that touch on these films and their content, which are my poems, A Guide to Forgiveness, which I referred to earlier, and Devil, which was inspired by Baldwin's interaction with Elijah Muhammad. A few weeks into the Baldwin program and doing the work for my project, I found myself getting very emotionally exhausted, and I began to stray away from race and simply focus on the idea of love. Who has it, how it's shared, and how it's maintained. In an interview with Mavis Nicholson on Mavis on 4, James Baldwin said, "Love is where you find it, and you don't know where it will carry you." He continues, "It is a terrifying feeling, love. It is the only human possibility, but it's terrifying." This is one of Baldwin's many insightful pieces, and still rings around my head, when I feel like the boundaries of my identity are structured for me through the heteronormative patriarchal lens of love. Meaning love that is structured and often enforced to be strictly as cis men and cis women in our society. The creative process that went into developing The Gap Between Us was quite a journey. Thanks to the scholarships I received, I was able to gather materials in preparation for my trip and project development. I visited paper presentation to gather paper goods and inspiration for the design and color palette. I also made some of my various writings in Muji notebooks and pens, in addition to other brush and fine point pens from local art stores in New York. While I was in France, I found an entire block in the 18th arrondissement that had paper and pen goods. I was in heaven. Since I was handwriting multiple letters and poems a day, finding a destination that had all these resources, especially in France, was incredible. It gave me a chance to explore different pen styles, paper qualities, and textures. There was a point during the trip where I was gaining inspiration from all over and was running out of notebooks. So I wrote in the Notes app on my iPhone, handwrote my thoughts on a napkin, or would type them up on a computer, which led me to diversifying the types of writing platforms within the zine. Instead of just handwriting it all, on the slides above me, I have some examples of the various writing platforms I utilized. Doing this felt more authentic to my writing process. The reader is able to follow my journey as I took it, versus it being entirely augmented for a handwritten aesthetic. Now I want to share a significant moment during the Baldwin writing program that helped me develop the title of my work. As a class, we read Between the World and Me, a poem by Richard Wright, where I was inspired by the idea of there being something between me and the people I'm addressing through my writing. I identified this something to be about navigating my own agency in a distant country, and thus became The Gap Between Us. As a final collection, The Gap Between Us became a compilation of my notes, mantras, poems, and letters in the style of a zine. It's split into 2, soon to be 3, collections organized as the originals, the edits, and the revisions, which is my next venture as I continue on working on this project. It was important for me to split it into 2 collections because it shows the full thought process from my natural writing style to the edits, which are curated for clarity and quality. But I would like to produce it as a 3-pack zine compilation to show the full extent from beginning, middle, and reflection. Producing this project felt liberating, but also opened up more questions on how I got to be where I am and what shaped me. I have given people agency in my life over my own, and this project was a way for me to claim the faults and identify the moments for reclamation. I believe this also reigns true for my colleagues, Michelle, Toni Marie, and Chloe. Individually, we produce projects that reflect on our own way of claiming agency in a society with institutions that are structurally ingrained to challenge us. But together, we identify these institutions and are now vocalizing our truth to you. Now it's your turn to identify where you can claim agency in your life. Thank you.
Okay, now's the Q&A portion. So if anybody has a question, you can just raise your hand, I guess. Yes.
What's your favorite poem?
Oh my gosh. Book, essay, article, what specific?
Book.
Another Country, which is the one I referenced before. It's just, there's so many levels to it. It's really dynamic.
Yes.
When you were interviewing folks in the parks,
Yes.
what was the most, like the moment where you felt the greatest amount of fear?
I think as soon as I because initially I would just say like, hi, can I ask you a few questions? And be like, yes, of course. And then I would say like, why did you ask that? And they would give whatever, exciting responses. But then when I would say, do you know that that's considered street harassment and that can negatively affect people's mental health? That was probably the scariest moment because that's when it really, like the dynamic really changed. And as you guys saw, they got very defensive and yeah, so that was it. Yes.
This is for Sjournee. How did you kind of reckon with the discomfort of the self-excavation throughout this entire journey? Did you have strategies for managing that?
Sorry, it's a very great, heavy question. It was navigating myself in that it's hard, to be honest. And I think a lot of it helped that my classmates during the Baldwin trip were really open and were able to listen to me and honestly give true feedback. Like there was a moment when we were at I forgot what park it was, but we were sitting in like a circle and we just kind of laid everything out. We were like, we're not all from the same demographics, we're very different, but we're here and we're willing to listen to each other, and how does that make us feel different, and how do we support each other in that? And so I think honestly having some sort of support and being able to have that freedom and that time, because a big part of it is having the time to reflect. I feel like in New York I never would have had that time. So yeah, just finding people that will be willing to listen and be there for you.
This is kind of like a question to everybody. Just because their topics were, I felt like they had to do with themes within like our deeper psychologies as people and how we've been programmed by the society that we're in and how we deal with space. But what kind of like emotional, spiritual work do you feel like we have to start like engaging in order to be able to like reprogram our psychologies, our subconsciouses, so that we can engage in space in a way that respects all the different representatives, like individuals within that space. Within the context of males feeling that they can just call out to women that they might find attractive, for students of color, and just like the topic of colorism, of how we can feel like we can speak about those issues in a space, honestly, not holding back, where it can produce some kind of like forward movement for people of different races. It's a big question, but that's kind of what I've been thinking in this seat after listening to everybody speak. So just based off of your research and your time, like within yourself doing this work, like what do you feel like are some steps? It could be minor or just questions, just thoughts about that.
Sorry. I can say one thing, which is I think that after I met with all the women and just thinking about my own life, I think that everyone maybe in this room in some right could actually identify themselves as a criminal. I think that we've all done things that technically were against the law, and that at different points in our lives, because of our privilege or power, you know, a myriad of circumstances, that means that we get to escape incarceration or interacting with the police or whatever it may be. I mean, all of us are criminals, and I think that I was nervous to meet with a lot of the women because I didn't necessarily know how they were going to feel about me inserting myself in their lives, and I didn't know if I was going to be coming from a place of judgment, even though I thought that, you know, I've been working with domestic violence survivors, I know, you know, everything, but I think that you realize that everyone is just a person, and the second that you start to realize that we're all criminals, if we want to label it, we shouldn't be labeling it that way, we all just need help, and we need to identify our own privileges and work to combat that within the institutions. And then on a spiritual level, I mean, all of the women I spoke to really went through their own spiritual journey and having to deal with their own past in the institution. The ones who I spoke with had received a lot of assistance, so they were able to kind of have this really beautiful stories that I wish that I could have gotten to. But it was a lot about that personal growth and personal development inside of the institution that should have taken place outside of the institution. And it could have been as simple as a neighbor or someone saying to them, I see you, I hear you. It's New York City, I know we all don't want to be involved in everyone's lives, but if you hear something, you see something, just pull someone aside and with an open mind and compassion and ask them, what's going on? You know, because it's not safe for someone to call the police and say someone's beating me up. That's the reality. But if maybe you have someone else in your building to kind of help diffuse the situation, it could be.
Yeah, I think that our projects each touched on a handful of the different kind of institutions that are in place that create that strip us of agency. But within each of our projects, in small ways, we were able to kind of go about trying to reclaim some of that agency. And so just the ways you can do it little bits at a time instead of just one big go of it.
I also think that like when you self-reflect, being able to think about what other people might need, like you realize, oh, maybe like Chloe's having a bad day, and if I was having a bad day, what would I want? What do I need? What could she need? That's also something else.
Yes.
I just happen to be reading about cases of harassment of women on the street during occupations. France, the women, beautiful Frenchmen walking down the street and a German soldier whistles at them. What are you going to do? I mean, that's real terror. Mm-hmm. Now, the American and British in Germany had a no talk to, no touch, no nothing policy, defraternization. I figured, aren't these gentlemen, isn't this wonderful? No, the real reason was the Russians were probably raping one of the women, and the Allies on the other side wanted to show hands off. It lasted about a year, and then everyone was doing everything. So I think there's a strange dynamic that is so powerful between it's almost masters, you know, and altered in a sense when the situation of man and woman, that it's very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I have a question.
Do you think in the interviews with the guys you were able to change their mind at all, or
No. I think that if, no. I think that perhaps, I mean, yeah. Maybe, or, you know, if I had continued to try and engage in more conversations, maybe, but, you know, I got immediately very uncomfortable, and there were some situations where they would move closer towards me after I would say that. Or other situations where there was a group of men who all catcalled me, and I stopped and talked to all of them, and then they all kind of circled around me. So, like, walking away from that was important. But I do, I think the friend that was my bodyguard and his reaction to it was one of my favorite outcomes of the whole thing. Okay. Yes?
follow-up question for you, Courtney? Did you read anything about
do any specific research into that, but I know I've worked as a nanny for 5+ years, and so I've worked with kids from ages of 2 to 11, and at least from what I've seen, there's been a big shift around the age of 6, and when they start being very aware of what their gender is and how that plays out in society and how they, move because of that.
Also, just to about that and to get Chloe to talk more, during our class and workshopping this presentation, we definitely talked about the cultural differences in catcalling. In some European and Latin American communities, it's seen as flattery. So when people might come to New York, as the cultural melting pot that it is, we see that. And so some people do catcall from the sincerity of their heart, but not like a bike about. So
yeah, that was actually something that I wanted to and hopefully will explore a little bit further, is the different cultural implications of catcalling. I know that in a lot of like Brazil particularly, catcalling is like, if you don't get catcalled, then you feel like insecure. Yeah, like you want to get catcalled, and so just that dynamic is a whole other level. And my experiences in traveling and how catcalling has been very different in the different places I've gone.
I personally too, but with catcalling, I was getting very angry, and then I always respond. I want to know what you think is the best solution to it, because oftentimes the walking away gives them the power. I feel like when you talk back to them, that's what they realize, sort of. I think also when you ask questions, that's really good. I think it's really about thinking of it. And I think, although I think you can get into problems, and that's everything that connects to girls, it's that often, or guys, or whatever, it's like people often don't say anything because they're scared of getting into this situation.
Yeah, I think safety is a very big concern. If you're comfortable, I mean, I'm not going to say don't ever engage people, but I can speak from experience that I don't consider myself a shy person. I don't consider myself afraid to talk to strangers, but after engaging those men, even with a friend following me, I was very uncomfortable and very aware of all of my surroundings. But I have had, and so in my research paper, which is what my presentation was based off of, I talk a lot more about I've had personal experiences of other women coming and like checking in with me or intercepting it, and that being a really great moment. Or like if you see a woman or anybody get harassed on the street, kind of going up and being like, hey, how are you? Like, are you okay? How are you feeling? And that kind of being a more restorative approach. It's not necessarily going to stop them from doing it in the first place, but I think that's because I think it should be on the perpetrators, not the victims, to stop it. Yes?
This is a question for Toni. You're talking here about the origins of this project being in the first year seminar, and so the way that first year seminar at Lang dealt with or deals with consent. How can you talk a little bit about about the issues you have with that and how that may have changed since you developed the programming?
yeah, so the Sexy Collective was actually founded in 2010, so I think I was in middle school then. But as for experience, in my first year seminar, the way that the new school approached sexual education and consent was an online class that I was supposed to do before coming to campus. I think it maybe took me 20 minutes, and I kind of just buzzed through and didn't even read the questions, just had to submit my answers. So working with the Sexy Collective, we really try to, especially that first week, you're familiar with new school, so we do the block party. So we always try to have PHAs and Sexy Collective members at the block parties say, hey, come here and learn about sex education in a positive and more comprehensive way, and also a more personal way. At the new school, a lot of our student body is international, so most of them have never had a formal sexual education class. So at the Sexy Collective, we really like to host the sexualities, which I mentioned, which are just weekly or bi-weekly meetings, where just any questions can be asked, any clarifications can be made to bridge the gap. Yes.
or formalism, which are not natural to the creative process. So I'm wondering, like, how you, as a writer and as a creator, or someone who's also been institutionalized to think of works as finished and formal, like how you went about the process of claiming your agency to show your process and to show the, the different layers in which your thoughts can be perceived, etc. I always think about that. Like, I need to show my unfinished stuff, and I don't know, it feels like it's not good enough, or like someone will laugh at you. But I just felt like that was so important because that's where it all came from,
I appreciate that because I always, with my work or with this work specifically, I feel like it's kind of always going to be a work in progress because I mean, you always add more letters to it, you add more poems to it, it can kind of evolve. Sorry, I might throw out all of your questions.
Like, how did you subvert white professionalism in order to truly show your creative process?
Just did. I was like, yeah, because I mean, I just wanted it made sense. I think that's what the biggest part about it was, like, this is my original one. It'll go on the original spot. This one is my, like, I'm trying to make it feel like what I think Scott Core wanted me to write. And then, so then I kind of navigated it with, like, here's my natural writing style, how I think about it in education ways, and then revisions is like me being like, this is dumb. I don't believe this anymore.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question for Michelle, and I apologize if I missed this, but during your research, did you reach out to the administration of the prisons or jail system or the parole boards, and were they open to speak with you?
No, I didn't because a lot of the, but this goes into like a whole like research, qualitative, like quantitative, like all this kind of stuff. It was supposed to be like survivor based, just from their perspective. Like if you read my paper, it's really their stories. I've spoken with people who have spoken with those, parole board members, and one of the women actually had an opportunity to speak directly to the New York State Parole Board and share her story, and got a really amazing, apology on behalf of the 20 years that she was in there of all the members. And there are working to change a lot of the becoming more trauma informed, to change a lot of their ways. But no, not for my research, because it was really supposed to be about just sitting with the survivors, not focusing on too much of the outside forces and just getting their experience, because they rarely get a chance to, share their story.